All across the globe, Egyptian obelisks appear in major cities, far removed from their original homes. Often a product of greedy imperial desires, they have, by hook or by crook, become staples of the cities they now call home. But I'd like to talk about a pair of obelisks, both referred to as Cleopatra's Needle, that now reside in New York's Central Park and along the Thames in London, dating all the way back to the 1400s. That's BC, by the way. Hi there, my name is Alec Belmore, and you're watching History and Intrigue. Let's take a trip to ancient Egypt, shall we, to 1474 BC and the reign of Thutmose III. On his orders, these two massive obelisks were constructed of granite in the city of Heliopolis, a city that no longer exists, but would have been just northeast of Cairo. The inscriptions we see today weren't added until 200 years later, however, on the orders of Ramses II as a nice pat on the back to himself for all of his military victories. But life moves pretty fast, and things can change over the course of 1,000 years. By 12 BC, the Romans had moved in and had removed both obelisks from Heliopolis to Alexandria, where they stood outside a temple built by Cleopatra in honor of either Mark Antony or Julius Caesar. As time went on, a great earthquake sent one of these obelisks toppling to the ground, our London boy, and covered it in sand, which actually ended up helping preserve the inscriptions on its side. The other one, our New York obelisk, remained standing where over the years it claimed the official Cleopatra's moniker by the locals. Now let's fast forward to 1801, to a time when imperialism was at least somewhat more brazen than it is today, and France and Britain were vying for political control over the Middle East. Napoleon ran a military campaign into Egypt and Syria against the Ottoman Empire under the guise of protecting French trade interests, but come on, we've all heard that one before. Britain was also poking its nose around in the area at the time, and the British Exploratory Corps under Sir Ralph Abercrombie, no Fitch though, met the French at Alexandria and ultimately won what would shockingly be called the Battle of Alexandria. The British felt like they had done a really great job in the battle, and they should be able to take an obelisk, the one already on the ground, as spoils for their victory. But they just had a heck of a time trying to figure out how to move it, and ultimately left it where it was. The next 70 years or so was a fun little square dance between the British and multiple Khedives, where the British would say, "Oh my god, Khedive, we just love this obelisk. It would look so great back at our place, so we really want it. But you've been dying to show your appreciation to us for all of our help in the past, so you should probably just give it to us." Okay, as long as this means we're cool and you're not gonna try any imperial funny business in the future. What? Us? Never. So we're gonna take the obelisk. Let me get Parliament on the line. Hey, Parliament, can we have some money to transport an obelisk to London from Egypt? No. Here's a letter from Samuel Briggs, British consul at Alexandria, that kinda illustrates the way the narrative was being spun.
Upper Tooting, Surrey, 11 April 1820.
Sir, having on my late visit to Egypt witnessed the stupendous labors of the celebrated Mr. Belzoni, I'm not doing the accent, and received from him the assurance that he could confidently undertake the removal of one of the granite obelisks at Alexandria, and the Viceroy of Egypt, Muhammad Ali Pasha, having frequently expressed his desire of making some acknowledgement of the handsome equipment of his corvette, yada yada yada, you get the idea. What this letter illustrates is that as much as the narrative suggests that it was all goodwill, not only for this specific obelisk, which the official story is that it was given in 1819, but for all that are scattered across the globe, there were clearly political pressures to deliver these gifts to the larger global powers. It wasn't until the 1870s that the British got the full go-ahead to take the obelisk, following Sir William James Erasmus Wilson, an anatomist and dermatologist, offering to fund the transportation himself at the cost of roughly £10,000, which translates to over a cool million if it were today. In 1875, they were good to go, but couldn't figure out how to complete the task. The obelisk weighed almost 200 tons, so it was pretty difficult to move. Couple that with the fact that it was unsafe for ships to approach the shore, and you had a real conundrum on your hands. It took them 2 years to figure out how to get the needle moving when they settled on an iron cylinder built around the obelisk. Once it was out to sea, it would be outfitted with a deckhouse, a mast, rudder, steering gear, turning the contraption into a makeshift boat. However, just as it hit the water, sand pierced the hull, filling the entire vessel because some crewmen had forgotten to shut the watertight doors inside. So it was pulled back out, repaired, and then finally out to sea. The Cleopatra, as it was dubbed, was tied to a steamship called the Olga no Pataki, each containing its own crew. It was smooth sailing until they reached the Bay of Biscay off the coast of Spain, where a storm ravaged the ships. The Cleopatra was in dire straits. The Olga sent a rescue boat out to help save the crew, but lost 6 men in the process. The storm was far too dangerous, and the decision was made to cut their precious cargo loose, expecting it to be lost forever. However, the obelisk was found by the enterprising captain of a Scottish steamer named the Fitzmaurice, who towed it into a port in Spain. For 3 months, the needle sat there while he haggled a finder's fee with the British government. Once they reached an agreeable price, the obelisk reached its final destination in London on January 20th, 1878. A number of spots were suggested to place the obelisk, but ultimately was planted along the Thames on the Victoria Embankment. Before it was finally situated upright, a time capsule was concealed in the pedestal, containing, amongst other things, a box of hairpins, a box of cigars, tobacco pipes, a bronze model of the obelisk, a portrait of the Queen, and photos of 12 of the most attractive British women at the time. We don't know who those women were, but based upon my reading of the Sports Illustrated Petticoat edition, here are my guesses for at least a top 5. Dame Chauncey Gigglemug, Brickley Church Bell, the Marquess of Pennysham Agnes Tiny Tot, Lavinia Pooples, and last but certainly not least, Bita Jam Bubbies. And now on to New York. Like many great American tales, it begins with an overreaching sense of entitlement, self-importance, and little brother syndrome. Here's a quote from the New York Herald that summarizes the situation nicely. It would be absurd for the people of any great city to hope to be happy without an Egyptian obelisk. Rome has had them this great while, and so has Constantinople. Paris has one, London has one. If New York was without one, all those great sights might point the finger of scorn at us and intimate that we could never rise to any real moral grandeur until we had our obelisk. And so began a months-long campaign to jockey Egyptian Khedive Ismail Pasha into giving the United States the standing obelisk known as Cleopatra's Needle as a, quote, gift of friendship. In 1879, he relented for more reasons than simple goodwill. France and England were pressuring the Ottoman Empire into overthrowing him. This gift hopefully would keep the United States politically neutral in the affair. In the end, it ultimately didn't matter, as he was removed at the behest of the British government later in the year for not cracking down hard enough on rebels who pushed back against European military influence in Egypt. As always, the real question here came down to a matter of funding. Where was the money going to come from? In steps William H. Vanderbilt, railroad tycoon and ancestor of one Silver Fox Anderson Cooper, with $100,000, equivalent to $2 million today, to finance the project. The Egyptian people had grown quite fond of the obelisk, naturally. It was theirs. So they weren't particularly happy when American excavators showed up to collect their prize. Some Egyptian people were so incensed by this injustice that they threatened violence against the American crew, but none ever really materialized. Unlike the British obelisk, the Americans had to figure out a way to safely lower Cleopatra's Needle into a horizontal position. To do this, they used a giant lever and pulley system, which they were finally able to put to use in December of 1879. It took 3 more months to get it hooked up to a track that would bring it to sea for transportation. Instead of building a giant iron contraption like the British, the American crew cut a hole in the bow of a decommissioned Egyptian mail freighter, sealed her back up again, and headed off to New York. When it arrived in the city, it was still up for debate as to where it would be placed. It was ultimately Vanderbilt again who suggested its current location by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It started its journey to the museum in possibly the worst place to be introduced to the city, Staten Island. It was then floated on pontoons to the docks on 96th Street. However, there was heavy rail traffic by the docks that proved to be a challenge. So to overcome this obstacle, they built a temporary bridge to avoid the trains. From there, it was dragged along 96th to Broadway, and then down 86th. The whole affair took about 112 days. When the obelisk was erected, its base also contained a time capsule. In it were coins, medals, and a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Doesn't seem like there were photos of the most beautiful American women at the time, but we'd like to throw out a few possible options. Arby Constitution. Irene Individualism. Birdie Bootstraps. The Knockout Nun from Nantucket. Sister Matisse Rachise. And Polly Mae Private Insurance. At the time, the obelisk was a major tourist attraction, but you'd be hard-pressed to find many people who clamor to see it today. With the addition of the Met's South Wing, it's actually obscured from street view. Seems like a whole lot of effort and imperial leverage for something that's history is underappreciated and misunderstood. Both the obelisks have found what are most likely their forever homes in London and New York, but I do think these stories should give us pause when considering things like cultural artifacts, even as much as it might suck to suggest those that are found in museums. We often think of these things as strictly educational, or at least apolitical, but as these stories show, they're often anything but. Well, that's all I gotta say about that. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you liked it, feel free to subscribe for more videos like this one. And if you didn't, that's okay too.